upon the proximity of two sensations, or indeed their coexistence within the same mental context. With regard to this feature, all the condensations of two qualities which are affected by the Proustian analogies could be said to have their basis in metonymies, since these qualities became joined together, or at least adjacent to one another, in the desires, daydreams, and intelligences of the characters and the narrator. In an even more explicit way, connections in space, the contagious effects of the sign, provide a metonymic basis for the majority of Proust's metaphors. The most striking case is the analogy woven across 30 or so pages between the Charlus-Jupien couple and the fertilization of the Duchess orchid by a bumblebee. Charlus hums, quote, like a bumblebee. Jupien stays, quote, implanted there like a tree. But at the same instant, says the writer, and in the same place, and here is the metonymy, their conjunction becomes juxtaposed with an amorous coupling between the orchid and the bumblebee, with the effect that the two couples are coexistent both in the time and in space, and in the perception of the narrator. From this viewpoint, Jupien, quote, struck poses with the coquetry that the orchid might have adopted on the providential arrival of the bee. What is contiguous becomes metaphoric. Whether it is integrated in metaphor or subject to its magnetic force, metonymy is the means of loading the Proustian analogy into space. It eliminates time but introduces space. Thus, the poetic impact of the analogy becomes inserted within the framework, which can also turn into the container of a plot. And this metonymical basis of the metaphor is, in my mind, the link between the Proustian poetic style and his narrative, which is based on metonymy, development of intrigue, and space development of characters. And yet, this immanence of metonymy within metaphor is not sufficient, as has seems being alleged by theoreticians, or as Genet, for instance, to transform the poetic tale originally foreseen by Proust into the complex narration which La Recherche turned out to be. Metonymy bathes the space, but it has a need of characters in order that the spatial framework which has been set up in this way can generate an action, with the characters going about their own modes of self-fulfillment. That's why next week I'll try to develop some aspects that have, in my mind, never have been developed in connection with Proust rhetoric, the status of the characters in the novel. But let me see here that the basis of this development of characters, of this building up of characters, is already given by the fact that the metonymy has an important role to do in the building up of the poetical style, because it's so essential in the construction of metaphors. But it's not enough. So we have this basis of metonymy into the poetical style, on the ground of which the characters will be built up. But there is also a particular logic of these characters that we shall discuss next week. What is more, and this is another aspect of the Proustian metaphor and the complexity of his style, the very complexity of Proust's metaphor, its contradictory, paradoxical nature, contains the germ of a form of figuration. What will be figured is precisely the type of psychic contraction which we call a character. And in order to prove itself, character will need the events that bulk so large in À la Recherche without making it in any way a suspense story. But this I will develop next week. Now let's try to see after the break another aspect of the metaphors that I called their goal to open a depth. And here we shall find the metaphor of the narrator as a surgeon or an X-ray operator. Just after the break.
Yeah, we'll have time to make sure.
Described by Proust as being a metaphorical one. I have to say that Proust doesn't refer precisely to these pieces. He refers in generally to the style of Rembrandt and Chardin. And I took just one of them without choosing particularly, but every one of those masterpieces can be utilized, I think, in order to demonstrate what is the style, substantial one from Chardin, and metaphorical in the Rembrandt case. And you see why it's metaphorical, because this is a thinker, and the staircase represents the meanders of thinking, for instance, or what is inaccessible. And on the other hand, you have the light that comes through something which is not enlightened. And you can see in this the metaphor of the awakening of thinking. So I'll have the light now for myself, and I'll come back to this two examples. However brief and fragmented, the analogy is the technique which gives rise to the instantaneous effect, like a bolt of lightning. Analogy cuts up the world and the story into successive links, as I have shown through the Vinteuil episode, sometimes heavy and sometimes light, which endow the Proustian discourse with the pregnant poetic quality of synesthesia. The synesthesia is this phenomenon when you take one sensation instead of another. For instance, hearing is described through the sense of seeing, or seeing is described through the sense of tactile perception, etc. So this mixture, or this superimposition of different kinds of feelings is called synesthesia. And Proust uses this, as you have seen this in the Vinteuil metaphors, when music becomes perfume, and music becomes woman, music becomes drawing, etc. So analogy cuts up the world and the story into successive links, sometimes heavy and sometimes light, which endow the Proustian discourse with the pregnant poetic quality of synesthesia, and at the same time causes the intermittent effect of a multitude of still frame presentations of the image. These sudden shocks, woven into circles, surprise us, leaves us thunderstruck, irritate or convince in turns. With their lining of sensation and their logic of condensation following the primary processes of the unconscious, they impose their own type of truth. I'll say that this truth is the analogical truth, so it goes back to the primary processes of the unconscious, as you know, described by Freud as essential logic of the dreams, displacement and condensation, metaphor and metonymy being for him the primary processes underlying the unconscious and the work of dreams, as he says, in opposition to the secondary processes that are logical processes. So this analogical logic is conveyed by Proust in order to reveal the essence of things, he says, the being. I have quoted it initially, which allows me to say that in Proustian text, the analogical is the ontological. The ontological refers to the being, to the notion of being, to the revelation of being. Proustian metaphor brings together appearances, but it also reveals the profundity of being. Analogy passes through the visible to the visible until it achieves a transparent unity, says he, where things become arranged in an order quite different from that which the intelligence necessarily imposes. They are, I quote, converted into one and the same substance, with no impurity, says Proust, and life acquires depth. And this is a quotation from Proust that you'll find in the kaleidoscope about metaphor. That life of ours, which cannot effectually observe itself, of which the observable manifestations need to be translated and often to be read back in laboriously deciphered. Our vanity, our passions, our spirit of imitation, our abstract intelligence, our habits have been long at work, and it is the task of art to undo this work of theirs, making it travel back in the direction from which we have come to the depth where that has really existed, where that has really existed lies unknown within us. Once he is capable of perceiving these things metaphorically in this way, working through intermittencies, the narrator gains access to, I quote, a sort of general essence, common to many things, which will be, quote, his nourishment and his joy, but only at a certain depth. It's another quotation. Joy in the depth, beyond the reach of observation, end of the quote. So, being quite distinct from observation, the metaphorical apprehension of depth will be compared first of all to the art of the geometer, who strips things of their sensible qualities and sees only their linear substratum. In the writer's case, this will involve a, quote, point which was common to one thing and to another, to one being and to another, quote, situated in the middle depth, out of the range of appearances, in a zone somewhat further back, end of the quote. So the first metaphor describing this search for the depth is the metaphor of the geometer. Why? Because the geometer strips things of their sensible qualities and sees only their linear substratum. But this initial analogy between writing and geometrical depth is soon supplanted by another. The metaphorical depth is described in terms of surgery and X-rays. I quote, and this is again in the kaleidoscope, so the apparent copyable charm of things and people escaped me because I had no ability to stop short there. I was like a surgeon who, beneath the smooth surface of woman's belly, sees the internal disease which is devouring it. And this metaphor is not naive and not insignificant one. The writer is a surgeon, I repeat, who beneath the smooth surface of a woman's belly sees the internal disease which is devouring it. If I went to a dinner party, continue the quotation, I did not see the guests. When I thought I was looking at them, I was in fact examining them with X-rays. End of the quote. This portrayal of the metaphoric imagination as a kind of surgical incision which passes beyond sensible qualities and uncovers, quote, the point which was common to one being and to another, and the quote, recalls the metaphor which Proust had used in an unfinished study to describe the art of Chardin. You have already seen this substantial art of pure, enlightened objects. And yet the painter, whose magical light reconstitutes in Proust's eyes the beautiful and immediate truth of simple, worn, and insignificant objects, is offered to us as the very opposite of a gynecologist. Is this a contradiction by reference to the surgeon that I just quoted and that comes of time regained, of the end of Proustian experience, while the metaphor of the Chardin's art as the opposite of a gynecologist is from the young Proust? It's an article written in 1896. Is it a contradiction? Not necessarily so. Chardin is presented as being at the opposite pole from the kind of gynecologist who might have the pretension to explain to a woman what the act she has had the mysterious strength to accomplish. End the quote. So Chardin is on the side of the woman and on the side of the flesh, as opposed to the verbiage of the gynecologist, of a man of science. Chardin immediately recalls the woman's act of giving birth, a straight light and no explanations given. When Proust takes up the gynecological metaphor for art once again, 25 years later, the narrator of À la Recherche is no more willing than Chardin to accept the explanations of the gynecologist. He may be keeping the same object of exploration, which is, quote, the smooth surface of a woman's belly, end quote. But instead of seeking to provide rational explanations, he X-rays it. And this in-depth illumination which he supplies to the most intimate parts, delving below the politeness of appearances, is not essentially different from the flood of light which inundates Chardin's Proustly objects. The old painter and the narrator come together in the form of the ideal artist whom the young Proust had described in his article about Chardin as, quote, a man of keener awareness, his delight too intense so that it overflows into unctuous brush strokes and immortal pigments, end quote. To go even further, the painter and the writer both participate in the lightening effect of the natural process of birth associated with woman, since all, quote, creative acts proceed indeed not from a knowledge of their laws, but from an obscure and incomprehensible power which we don't make stronger by illuminating it. End of the quote. Chardin, the artist of immediacy, stays with Proust even in Venice, as when the narrator of À la Recherche, in holiday there with his mother, finds the light of the old master mingled with the sensibility of Veronese in the gray-green tinctures of the sunshine. So there is a presence of Chardin even in the elder Proust through the light of Veronese in this case. Hence, it is from the earliest stages of his vocation that Proust is engaged in the search for another logic, which will supplant the laws of knowledge proper to ratiocination and natural sciences. His youthful studies enable us to understand that he made a distinction between a substantial style, this style of Chardin that I have already shown you, one that is capable of restoring in an instant, quote, the divine equality of all things before the mind that contemplates them, before the light that beautifies them, like the style of Chardin or Flaubert, that is the substantial style. And on the other hand, Proust differentiates a metaphorical style like that of Rembrandt, you have already seen, and later this metaphorical style will be the style of Elstir, the painter from La Recherche. I quoted already his painting of the seascapes that are metamorphical, not only metaphorical but metamorphical. And the metaphorical style will be also the Proustian style himself, a distinction which establishes imaginative connections and discloses the unsuspected depth of things in a way that appearances cannot do. Maybe we can see them again, these two kinds of styles. The substantial one, where things are alone, without any connection, just immediate, in a sort of mystical rapidity of the perception, just into the light of illumination, which is described as analogous to the creative power of the woman's ballet and of the writer in the same time, and is given in opposition to the gynecologist's verbiage. And on the other hand, we have the metaphorical style, where things proceed by links, displacements, and allusions, by analogy. And here we see this analogy between the thinker and the staircase. And this second style will be compared to the Elstir one, and also to the Proustian style himself. Well, this opposition has been done in an article about Chardin by the young Proust, but apparently the opposition sketched out here is hard to sustain. And in my mind, this difficulty to sustain this opposition is the reason why the article on Chardin remained incomplete. Proust had never finished it. We can say that he had never finished it because he had enough of Chardin and Rembrandt, but I think that more deeply the reason of this incompletion is that the opposition between the substantial and metaphorical style cannot be sustained. It may be true that quote, metaphor alone can lend a sort of immortality to a style, and in the whole of Flaubert there is perhaps no one good metaphor, and the quote says Proust in a rather Oedipal, I said, attack against Flaubert. But by contrast, Proust's close inspection of the objects illuminated by Chardin reveals, over and above their marked substantiality, their unmistakable and absolute, I quote, associations, affinities, and friendships. So, on the second analysis, Proust finds out that those so-called, firstly, substantial objects are not as substantial as they looked firstly, because they are associated. They are already in affinities and in friendships between them. In this sense, we can say that prior to any form of appearance, therefore, might be supposed there be a placing together. These objects are not alone. There are some vegetables, some cuisine objects, some pans and things very rudimentary, but they are always in some links between them. A relationship, there is always a sketch for an analogy from the beginning. And I quote this passage from this Proustian article showing out that the affinities and the friendships always precede the existence of any image and any immediate lightning. He says the following: Chardin goes further still in bringing object and people together. In these rooms, which are more than an object and than a person, two perhaps, which are the locus of their lives, the law of their affinities or their contrasts. the sanctuary of their past. So there is no presence in itself, there is no past in itself, they are not substances in themselves, they are always affinity, and this from the beginning. And here is friendship, end of the quote. Memory, affinity, and contrast are already contained in the most immediate of appearances. So I'll say that the ontological, or the substantial if you want, has no need to become analogical, because analogy is there from the start as a necessary equivalent for ontology, having unquestioned sway and establishing the necessity of art. Once there is imagination, described by the narrator as being, as I have quoted initially, my only organ for enjoying beauty, there is analogy. Once there is imagination, there is analogy. Even if Chardin, even in this immediate, very rudimentary representation of things alone, but if you look at them more accurately, they are not alone, they are always in some friendship, in some analogy, or in some contrast with other things. Being is doubtless there before us, but we can only enjoy it by imagining it in metaphors, in analogies, in friendship, in linkage. And yet, to the extent that the scheme of À la Recherche develops and the pages of the monumental work build up, analogy does not simply endure, extend, and take hold, but its sealed links, its cross-hatching of instants, become deployed within the action of the novel. So analogy becomes an action, which may not be a picture, but is certainly a social kaleidoscope, as he says. I shall return to a later stage of my lectures next week to the narrative syntax, which takes charge of these links of metaphors and draws them out in terms of their psychological equivalents, which are characters, across the enormous extent of the work. For the moment, we should notice that as the gynecologist has turned into a surgeon and X-ray operator, so the symptom has changed in its turn. The smooth belly, in the eyes of the young Proust writing his commentary on Chardin, enshrined alive in embryo, has been replaced in time regained by what the internal disease which is devouring it. So in the Chardin article, we have the depth of the woman belly as alive, as an embryo. And in the last part of La Recherche, the embryo is not there. We have just a disease that is devouring this woman's belly. This change is significant. Here is not merely a question of the hypochondria of a dying man, because you can say that in the last pages of La Recherche we have not a young Proust, but an old man, a little bit old. Of course, he's only 52, but sick, etc. And it's maybe only an expression of his hypochondria to replace the embryo by sort of sickness devouring the female body. But in my sense, there is not only a question of hypochondria of a dying man who is disillusioned with his Faubourg Saint-Honoré, once brilliant and now a parody of its former self. The depth at which the disease reveals itself over and beyond the embryo was surely a necessary factor in Proust's experience right from the start of La Recherche. For without this dramatic dimension of depth, which contains its appointed end, and that we have seen even in the metaphor of the Sonata Vinteuil, where the problematic of insanity appeared. So without this dramatic dimension of depth, which contains its appointed end, how could time have been prevented from fleeing ever onwards in search of anecdotes, like a realistic novel, or dissolving into shafts of poetic brilliance, as it was the case in the first narrative of Proust's Jean Sainteuil, that was unfinished because precisely of this poetical brilliance. Proust had steered past these two sandbanks, and in putting off his work, he was waiting for the very moment in which his experience of analogy would lead him to the deep-seated sense of evil, of death and evil. Only from this basis, and this is the most profound, if I can say, meaning of depth. Depth in the body, female body, incarnation, life, but beyond it, evil and death. And without this doubling, we cannot embrace the time otherwise than in anecdotes or in poetic brilliancy. So the search from this depth as containing evil and its own end is an essential characteristic of Proustian development of a narrative through the time dimension. Only from that basis could appearance and memory, spectacle and sensation, wordliness and essence be telescoped within the construction of a narrative whose metaphorical wave could be capable of extending over the cruelty of history and of society, with the writer joyfully supported by the certainty of his vision, playing his loom with a patient authority. We needed to take one further step into the closed spiral which constitutes the metaphorical logic of La Recherche. And this step will be the following. If analogy, in revealing the truth of the flesh, which is the evil, which is the death, if analogy, in revealing the truth of the flesh, asserts itself as ontology, we can say only the reverse, which is that ontology itself sparkles with a multitude of images. Compared with the ascetic life of the writer, society, which is reduced to mere worldliness and fashion, is no more than a spectacle of appearances placed together with or in contrast to each other, whose only reality springs from the ephemeral decrease of public opinion. As opposed to the experience of depth, this universe, the social universe, is the universe of caprice. An example of this is the character of Oriane, la Duchesse de Guermantes. As opposed to the experience of depth, the social universe is a universe of gossip. And this is the character of Tante Léonie describing this aspect of things. As opposed to the experience of depth, the social universe is the universe of whim, and this is Françoise. It's a universe of excommunication. This is the universe of Madame Verdurin. And hidden vice, and this is the universe of Charlus, Saint-Lô, and many others. This social universe is constructed from conventions and rhetorical features whose forcefulness as social decrees only serve to make the world in this sense and history itself seem more unreal. So in opposition to the experience of depth, social world seems more unreal. People have often expressed surprise at the decadent snobbery, not to say the thickly maturity, that Proust is supposed to demonstrate by his excursion into society and by the dominant place occupied by the world and fashion in À la Recherche. Yet not only is the narrator in no way complicit with the views of this mundane society of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, but he also amuses himself in cracking it. He enjoys taking X-ray images of an aristocracy which at the start exerts its own fascination in order to show what shameful depths it conceals, just as he likes to strip the ambiguities from a seascape, a kiss, or an expression of jealousy. He does so by unfolding the likenesses, the transferences, the counterfeiting, and the analogical processes. He leaps from one surface appearance to another, from one political intrigue to another, from one social caste to another. However, this decipherment of worldliness in all its modes does not lead him in the direction of an essence which would be there all alone, since it is only the essential experience of literature that appears divine to him. That is to say, there is no essence of society. Society is deprived of essence, and there is no essence in the nature either. The only essential experience is the experience of literature. Under the influence of metaphor, every other kind of essence is destructed. The essence of the spectacle crumbles into images, appearances, acts of mimesis. The essence of the world is analogy, to the extent that being is subsumed in opinion, which is a demonic array of transferences and metaphors. In this sense, Proust's view of society, far from being old-fashioned, comes close to our own, and the elegant pages of À la Recherche come to seem like one of the very first modern visions of the society of the spectacle, the society of the show, la société du spectacle, as it has been said by French philosopher Guy Debord. In advance of television and the media, the society of an opinion, which is the society of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, as it is recreated by Proust, transforms its supposed protagonist into mere apparitions, into looks. They are not essential characters, essential values, essential social looks, social values, social links. Every apparent essence is a mere look. Vision in depth can get beyond the pathos of love affairs, jealousies, and deaths in order to invest the social game with the universal and contagious presence of fleeting and reversible images. So, is the hope of X-ray in the essence of the fashionable world doomed to disillusionment? Does it mean that this Proustian X-raying the essence of the fashionable world finally guides us to a comprehension of the world as a disillusionment? On the contrary, we can sustain that it comes to its conclusion in an ironic and jubilant finale. It is easy to imagine Proust's sardonic but obviously stifled laughter when he demonstrates that this game of social hierarchies, this stock exchange of worldly values, this game of alliances, misalliances, and foolish claims have no further secrets to hide. Even Sodom and Gomorrah, though still unredeemed, are thoroughly tamed and take up their places there. The inverts interact marvelously well with these reflecting surfaces, reflections and false appearances which make up the conventions of society, in terms of which the trials of their senses like a last level of metaphor, becomes acknowledged and to work themselves out. So, is time regained in terms of metaphors, of sensations, links conjoining eras and images? And is this the end of the history? Yes, in one sense. For how is it possible to look into a future or project an action when no identity will keep within its limits any longer? Because what I'm trying to say is that because of this X-raying of every essence through metaphors, through multitude of images, there is no identity possible in the universe of the research, no value possible, and in this sense, no sense of history possible. So, in one sense, we can say that there is the end of the history in the Hegelian sense of the notion. Oriane lets herself down by holding a salon, whilst Madame Verdurin ends up a princess. Even vice can no longer claim to be extraterritorial. Perversion is an integral aspect of opinion in Time Regained, and everyone has one of their own, with the exception of the narrator who avows his aesthetic ambition, the only real one, absorbing and concealing all other looks. All that survives then is the intensity of passion and the rightness of artistic composition. Every other kind of essence is unsustainable. The only intensity of passion remains jealousy, love, and on the other hand, the rightness of artistic composition. Mauriac is quite correct to see in Proust, who distanced himself from God as well from grace, an exemplary form of witness which has had its effect on the writers who admired him by turning them away from Catholicism to become humanists and psychoanalysts. Because this X-raying the passions of love brings our illusions down to the level of a rose, which are there to hide the scorch marks of sadomasochism. The infinite being himself, God, the philosophical value, whatever kind of interpretation can give it, the result is the same. Every kind of infinite being cannot escape from this awareness of dissolution. He comes across as being porous, artificial, imaginary. There is no being which is not imaginary. If the writer feels justified in competing with his creativity, with the creativity of this infinite being, he can only profane it by recreating it. He strips it of its essential nature, appropriates it for himself, and for his part, he unveils the artifice of being. Proust's snobbery, so often denounced and so irritating as it is perhaps just a way of revealing this awareness of the omnipresence of artifice. Even the infinite being is an omnipresent artifice, which means that arts are dominating our experience, of showing that he belongs to the universal system of false appearances. It may seem paradoxical, but it is in fact in all lucidity that through unveiling the artificiality of love and of being, through allowing himself to be devoured by this artificiality, devoured by the world, devoured by the work, Proust qualifies as the most authentic of all the French writers of the 20th century without values, showing that values are X-rayed already and artificial. Is that perhaps the reason why so little reference is made to him, even though his fame was assured even before his death? After Proust, French literature celebrates Amour fou with Breton and Aragon and other surrealists, for instance. Or if you go in another direction, French literature turns into philosophy with Sartre. It turns into politics with Malraux and morality with Camus. It strips itself down once again in Flaubertian fashion with the minimalism of Blanchot and Le Nouveau Roman. And lastly, with writers like Céline, French literature competes with the Proustian quest for emotion. Nobody is more closer to Proust than Céline because of this search for the depth behind style, and this depth is for Céline as for Proust sensation, emotion. But symptomatically, and there are a lot of things to say about this, but maybe we'll come into the discussion. Céline rejects Proust and he rejects what he calls his Franco-Yiddish style and his sexuality. So the French literary tradition after Proust is very uncomfortable with him. They don't know how to deal with his search for depth and with his construct about an end of history, about irradiation, metaphorical radiation, I would say, of every kind of value, the infinite being, of course, but of every kind of identity. Blanchot's orphism is exceptional in the attention that it pays to Proust. Blanchot is maybe the only one who pays attention to this Proustian irradiation of the being through metaphor. But it gives pride of place to the implosion of emptiness, as I have already said, that fills the sphere of time regained. Blanchot's farsightedness is still overweighted by his silence about the violent workings of evil, but about the violence of sadomasochism, for instance, which for Proust remain the unescapable reverse side of the inconsistency of being. And about this aspect, the eroticism of sadomasochism, of evil, problematics that we can discuss next week when we are going through characters like Albertine or Charlus, such aspects are entirely ignored by Blanchot's, on the other hand, far-sightedness of the commentary about Proustian work. There is another writer, two maybe, Mauriac and Bataille, that were interested by Proustian text. And it makes me say that it was left to a Catholic moralist curious to know the delights of hell, such as Mauriac, and to an explorer of mystical experience, such as Bataille, to insist upon an amoral nature of Proustian work. The one in order to deplore it. This was the case of Mauriac, who was disappointed by this amoral nature of this work that irradiates the infinite being and dissolves it, and the other, Bataille, to praise it, both of them equally in admiration. But the unity of Proustian experience, sensual, artful, and blasphemous, still escapes us. But I hope that after my lectures, they will escape less. Thank you. So now we have a lot of time for discussion. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the Silly Proust resemblance?
There are a lot of theoretical statements in Céline's work, but also I can refer to my own analysis of his style in order to demonstrate that what was interesting for him in literary work is to reach emotion through a style. In the beginning was emotion, he says. In the beginning was not verb or language. In the beginning was emotion. And he tried to reach emotion through musicality of style and through a particular syntactical cuts of his sentences, the goal of which was precisely to involve the reader into a rhythmical and emotional experience. And this resemblance, however, has never been recognized explicitly as a reference to Proust. And when the correspondence of Proust has been published very recently with Gaston Gallimard, he referred in this correspondence to Proust, describing, I think it was a letter to Gaston Gallimard, describing his style as not French. And he says it's a Franco-Yiddish. And here we find...
Céline to Gallimard?
Yes, Céline to Gallimard. It's in the things published this summer by Gallimard, of course, the correspondence of Céline. And I think it's a very negative qualification, but in the eyes of Céline, because everybody knows that he had written anti-Semitic pamphlets, etc., during the Second World War. But in the same time, it's when you know his competition with Proust and his competition with Proustian style in order to capture emotion into words, we can say that it's a very ambiguous qualification because Proust and Céline didn't attempt to identify themselves with the classical French rhetoric. So be alien in the language is a positivity, is a positive mark. And when Céline says that he writes in Franco-Yiddish, of course he's a critic, but in the same time it's maybe not only a critic, because you have to write in a different French in order to be a writer, and not merely to repeat classical French. So I think that this expression is quite ambiguous, but we can, in a sense, just underlie the negative aspects, and in order to prove how Proust is felt to be enormous and embarrassing by the following generations, and Céline particularly. Yes.
Could you possibly speak on places that the Gothic elements in this artistic framework that you mentioned? Maybe if you think Ruskin's influence on
Ruskin's?
Gothic period as a motif in the novel, being an finished quality of that whole aspect of the aesthetic.
I have the impression that there are two questions in your question. The first one is the Gothic immanence, in the sense of the Proustian style, and the second one is the influence of Ruskin. They are not, in my mind, they are not going in the same direction. Ruskin's influence is mainly the discovery of the importance of the Catholic art and La Cathédrale d'Amiens, for instance, and Venice. And Proust had written articles from the time of his youth about the importance of this Christian art, and particularly about the presence of people in the cathedrals. He was against the lay and republican tendency to close cathedrals, which was prevailing for a period in the French history, because he had the impression, following Ruskin, that those monuments churches, cathedrals, and Venice particularly, are the real presence of the Western civilization, and he needed the presence of human beings in these monuments in order to practice what is for him an aesthetic religion without God, but nevertheless going through images that are felt, they are sensorily experienced, and that's why he needed the ritual. So he referred to Ruskin in his article in favor of the maintenance of cathedrals. And also we see this, in my mind, this influence of Ruskin into the image of Venice in the novel La Recherche de Tempértude, which is a very important image. And in my book, from which I'm giving here some fragments, I developed Venice as if it was a character, a living character. So vivid and impressive this city is described in my mind by Proust in La Recherche. We can compare it to another character as Oriane or Verdurin, or real human character. And it's very interesting also because of the fact that essential relationship between the narrator and his mother occurs in Venice. So the idea behind this would be that this Christian, or in the sense of polyphonic art that is represented in Venice brings to the surface a kind of depth which is a maternal one, and goes back maybe to the pre-monotheistic religions. Well, this for as far as Ruskin is concerned. But about the Gothic aspect, I think that we can find it in this obsession of Proust about what is evil, what is death, and what is abjection, unbearable excesses of passion. And he describes this particularly when he refers to homosexual eroticism, be it male or female. And I'll try to go back to this feeling of eroticism as a fault, as guilty, when I'll be dealing with the character of Albertine from the one hand, the character of Charlus from the other. This is, in my mind, what I would call the Gothic aspect of his work. Sexuality as guiltful. Yeah. No.
The second question has to do with the relationship between appropriation or generation and diversity. And again, how those are superimposed upon each other on that particular.
Well, as far as the first question is concerned, those two images have been proposed in different periods of Proustian work. The first one is in an article from 1896, when Proust was a young writer, and it's more optimistic, maybe in connection with his own juvenile perception of the world. I don't know, but we can suppose this. And the second one is from the time regained, which is the last pages of La Recherche. But in my mind, what is essential that those last pages of the La Recherche that have been